Hello, this is Josh again. I'm making this video in continuation of a series that properly defines my design philosophy and my efforts to make the best game. The end goal in this venture is to accelerate the market progression to higher quality content, particularly by encouraging additional efforts into pre-production. I've already discussed with great detail why pre-production is the best avenue to accomplish this in my other videos. The subject of this section of videos is to establish where we as designers fall into the scope of the entirety of gaming and entertainment culture, as well as our responsibility towards it. I'll start from the beginning with media as a whole. As early as 1986, film has played a large part in the attraction of the genre of fiction in a way that was previously unprecedented and marks the point at which entertainment evolved from purely secondhand anecdotes that you'll find in books or storytelling to at least first-hand witnessing, albeit sometimes tricked into believing as such via compelling fiction. From this point, the media changed not only in precedence and format, but also gained another feature which I mean to affirm in this video, that is an overall increase in the potency of the entertainment value itself. Said straightforward, motion picture induces an objectively higher level of entertainment than static picture or text, not to mention being easier to digest by a wider audience, no longer necessarily limited by language barriers, at least as far as fiction is concerned. Now, when you ask people a question like, is TV better than books, most hipsters will tell you no, and cite 100 reasons as to why books are better for you and why TV is bad for you, or that books are more practical and so forth. And perhaps they are, but I don't give a shit, and that wasn't the question. Quickly rid yourself of the stereotypical answers you've taught yourself to enjoy being force-fed, and consider this. What story can be said to be definitively better if told in a book or by oratory than if played before you in a motion picture? The obvious answer is none, although most people, when pressed, will state something akin to the citation of the latest crap, show or adaptation that has left a bad taste in their mouth for one reason or another. This is simply a case of making a generalization from the specific, a logical fallacy. Motion picture is infinitely more difficult to portray and create than a book or story, and hence bears the marks of those difficulties. And while those traits might forever be unavoidable, the fact remains that if it were possible to capture a story perfectly in motion picture, it would have all the benefits of the story and also exhibit the benefits of seeing and hearing things firsthand, and therefore be definitively superior to its source material counterpart. Once more, quantity is quality. Anyone who thinks they still need proof of this can ask any writer if they would like to see their work put into a movie, or just ask someone who has been somewhere majestic if it would have been the same if they had just read about it instead, and then stand there as they laugh in your face. Now, it almost goes without saying that the entire appeal to film can be simplified to the feeling that it delivers over that which is only rehearsed inwards or absorbed by second-hand account. But I'll say it anyways, motion picture itself is of higher octane stuff than its predecessors. Now, granted, seeing something on a screen isn't the same as first-hand experience either, but I'll get to that when the time comes. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, I can reveal my point, which is that with the evolution of higher-octane entertainment, a positive correlation can be seen alongside a larger amount of time invested in entertainment. This serves to explain why Gallup polls and other sources for about 10 to 20 years now show that the number of adults that don't read any books for the course of the year continuously goes up to what is now around 25% as of 2014. But of course, the number of adults who don't read any books when you exclude books that are read for anything other than recreation is upwards of 50% and more or less continues to increase. Interestingly enough, though, the number of people who only read popular books during the last decade isn't stressed. I'm curious to know just how many people only read books like Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, Twilight, and Hunger Games just because of how popular they are and how much the number is being inflated by popularity, specifically because movie adaptations, or just how much reading for recreation is being kept afloat by them. Similarly, because I'm sure that every person wouldn't have been required to state what it is they read, and even if they did, would seem like a wasted effort to distinguish books from what some of my hardcores and otakus out there might consider reading, i.e. comics and manga. Nevertheless, to few people's surprise, I'm sure, reading as a medium for entertainment is somewhat stagnant in the 21st century, whereas the number of people who watch some form of TV, be it streaming or cable, is still around 5 hours a day when you average out children who watch modestly large amounts, teenagers who watch greatly reduced amounts, and the elderly who watch the majority, which average out to be something like 20% of your waking life if you happen to live a long life. Because of this, I'm willing to make the assumption that it far exceeds the amount of time reading things purely for entertainment when compared to the amount of time spent watching TV, which is primarily used exclusively for entertainment, even if you cut down that 20% to a generous 10% because of the time spent watching things like news and weather, if you like. But regardless of the exact statistic, when you get down to the content's appeal in terms of accessibility, ease of entry, social relevancy, and so forth, the fact that TV has these traits in higher quantity despite perhaps being of less admirable content would seem to imply that the net enjoyment of television is still greater than that of reading, which typically has a much lighter stigma to it. But now, in the 21st century, the original question is ready to be asked again. How does it compare with gaming as a medium for entertainment? How does the incumbent, if you will, of the most popular medium compare with the newest form of entertainment? Well, firstly, to be absolutely clear, the amount of time spent watching TV still far exceeds the amount of time spent playing games in America, but just like reading and TV and or perhaps movie and theater, which I did not research, but am willing to assume that monetary restrictions were the main cause of people not getting behind attending them over reading whenever possible, as well as not getting TV even sooner, which when they were first commercially available were around $500 in a time when the average American made less than $2,000 a year, and when there wasn't much to watch even if they wanted to. Gaming has picked up a lot of speed and has gained an international venue and is beginning to encroach upon time spent watching TV. The obvious question to follow here is, why? Well, as you no doubt have already guessed, it is because of the same reasons that TV outgrew reading. It is, simply put, of higher octane stuff than TV. The amount of actual pleasure on aggregate can be asserted to be higher than that of which is experienced with television without being completely unsubstantiated. But how do we know this? What reason is there to believe that gaming offers more entertainment per square inch than television? To answer this, we use the same logic that put television over reading as well, the actual differences between the composition of the medium. Television offers first-hand witnessing of content instead of second-hand accounting of it, but gaming actually puts the audience in the realm of the first-hand experience by virtue of the participants' ability to control or interact with their content which is quickly mastering the ability to emulate real-life experience. When you make this assumption, it serves to explain the pull and success of gaming and why it is feasible to make the case that it is more effective as entertainment than television. But also more specifically, and what I aim to address in this section as its real purpose, is why it may perhaps be more addicting than anything the entertainment medium has ever created indirectly. Of TV and internet, typically the biggest obstacle to the people who doubt the legitimacy of the activities as plausible reasons for addiction is because the comparison to narcotics is difficult to convey. Both TV and internet exhibit most of the same properties, with the latter allowing for slightly more control of the content. Well-known and documented addictions to the degree that I'm not sure I need to preach awareness of them to you. It's trivial to find accounts of those who attest to being influenced by the hedonistic pull of the medium. Yet despite this, a professional definition and recognition of these behavioral addictions is scarcely put forth, and data that is presented is held to be highly contentious. The primary problem with appending the DSM with a classification of disorder that describes addictions to internet, TV, and gaming is because unavoidable tendencies appropriately summarized as pathologizing normal behavior drives prevalence estimates spuriously high and render the disorder into something of limited clinical value. Or in other words, failing to distinguish people's problems and the need to escape from those problems from a disorder that actually causes those problems. So the first task of deciding whether or not games and conventional media constitute some kind of threat, it seems, is to ask, are they at all, or at least the most objectively entertaining of them, that being games, addicting in the same way? This is answered by presenting another obvious question. What makes the experience of something addicting? The most contemporary authorities would denote an addiction as something that meets several criteria regarding how much the activity is indulged, to what length you are willing to go to attain it. But perhaps what is arguably the most distinguishing is the withdrawal symptoms that occur when a victim is deprived of that activity. Things like irritability, depression, loss of sleep and or appetite, and so forth, all of which are characteristics of those that suffer from addictions of drugs and recreational media, including gaming, perhaps most notably internet gaming disorder. Although less common in America, gaming in particular has also been associated with child neglect, leading to child abuse, sometimes resulting in death, to both inadvertently and purely fatalistic suicides. These are not claims I make lightly, and they don't even touch on any of the abuse you may or may not acknowledge as relevant in the form of online bullying in gaming circles. But do keep in mind that these are outliers, as many critics will tell you, but this is exactly my point, I'm afraid, that the real problem is underneath. The simple fact that it takes a great amount of time and invested hours away from your real life to manifest symptoms with the severity that I mentioned, as much as thousands of hours per game even. This is what is causing the real damage, I would suspect, because it is much harder to measure how much recreation becomes damaging and how much opportunity cost there is affecting any number of people because we don't know just how many people still invest hundreds if not thousands of hours, but don't develop addictions with conspicuous consequences. But I think we can all agree that we have all wished we had never wasted our time playing a given game before out of simply procrastination, if nothing else. Or perhaps a better example might be the preference of expedient results in streaming or the like, which have no real-world value, and if it can be assumed that these activities don't replace private recreation, also come at the expense of invested training or education, or workplace experience which addictions are commonly known to impede upon. Still, a distinction should be made, however, to simply point out that behavioral addictions cannot influence you in the same way that physical alterations to your blood chemistry, and many symptoms of these addictions will remain exclusive to them, and for very good reason, I would also submit. So then the second task to maintain the proposal of a perceived risk with conventional media must then be to identify something exclusive to the indulgence of the media to make up for this fact, and further proclaim its legitimacy. The strongest evidence for this is that the entertainment media are super stimuli. For those who aren't familiar with the term, I highly suggest you look up a professional explanation, but they can be roughly described as sensory information that cause primal urges to overrun their evolutionary purposes. Media is, in fact, deliberately designed to take advantage of these things, as we see all the time, in the form of potent but nevertheless evidently effective advertisements that appeal with sex, bright colors, friendly expressions, and so forth. But in the case of TV and internet, and the most effective of the high-octane superstimuli, gaming, I would also argue that we are reaching a breaking point quickly. That is to say, that a time when these superstimuli will become harmful is approaching. We can already notice its effects from the exaggerated photoshopped women to cartoon caricatures of women that have a sizable impact on the media they are popular in, and even straight-up anthropomorphic animals. These things play on our instincts of attraction and appeal, and as a result, we idolize concepts that aren't real. It's the equivalent of a bird being attracted to a cardboard cutout of an attractive mate, or simple things like being under the impression that animals can smile at you and are somehow friendly. Social status is also another stimuli that is already affecting our ambitions as we try to attain them. The idea that movie stars or popular musicians live a life of complete luxury where everyone they meet thinks they are interesting, as portrayed in media, is such a systemic inflation of an idea that it is embedded in the minds of children, as if being famous is something you can actually aspire to, in fame school or something, when in reality it's the exact opposite, in that pioneers of their craft pursue risk and gain fame only if they succeed through arduous efforts. A quick lesson for those seeking the life of fame on a road no one else has traveled before. Pioneers and activists are the most miserable people alive, because they are forever stuck in a world they despise, and even if by some miracle they succeed, it will have cost them the term of their lives. Being famous without being successful is quite pointless in this context, but I digress. The most important open-ended question on this topic to ask of everyone, both those for and against the motion, is, are you willing to bet that as we tirelessly move to perfect gaming's capabilities for stimulating our instincts in ways that please us subconsciously, that we will never get to the point where entertainment value is so great that everyone will be compelled to consume it, and that outliers who exhibit the behavior indicative of influence from superstimuli will become the norm? If not, then what about the next level of medium of entertainment that usurps the throne of gaming, such as real virtual reality or some link in between? Are you still willing to bet then that the potency and escape into this entertainment will never outweigh the incentive to live a life without it? If not, how about the next medium, and the next one, and the one after that? I, of course, as an author of science fiction, overly biased as I am, would submit to you that it will do so inevitably, and that the longer we take to acknowledge escapism as a real issue, the worse we are off for it. But before you answer, allow me to describe the basis for my position. Escapist fiction, as some writers would define it, is the term usually given to fictional writing that facilitates the vicarious indulgence of an alternative reality in an attempt to separate themselves from their reality, presumably because the fictional world is more appealing than the real world to that person. However, this description fails to do one thing with its definition, which is describe or imply the inherent differences between escapist fiction and what is essentially escapist non-fiction. I would assert this to be a necessary distinction only because non-fiction can be just as capable of stipulating escapist behavior. One example that admittedly falls outside my experience, but I would nonetheless be willing to categorize as escapist non-fiction content, are perhaps the reality shows or bloggers. This is because the ability of people to escape into that reality is not hindered in any way and can even be bolstered by the fact that it isn't fake or inauthentic in a way that lends itself to be more easily digested and subsequently escaped to. The most obvious reason for this is namely because no matter what content you enjoy imagining yourself in is by definition no longer non-fiction. And so you can literally change the word fiction to non-fiction in the term escapist fiction without having to alter the definition in any way. And so you could say it's even worse than a pointless distinction. All of which is deductive reasoning that the escapist property is not necessarily connected or exclusive to writing and fiction in the first place, and is just a byproduct of a person living a less appealing perceived existence. Now, this isn't news to anyone watching, I would hope. Everything and anything can be used to escape from reality, but who could really argue that some aren't better than others? That, to me, is the only area worth distinguishing, the actual criteria for the escapist property. To begin, as I stated earlier, the necessity for the definition to be applicable to both fiction and non-fiction is present and must coincide with the ability for that criteria to be improvable or dynamic in order for there to be a variance of preference within similar content. Starting with the components of storytelling, both fiction and non-fiction alike, as we have discussed in my earlier videos, setting, characters, plot, and conflict, you will find no particular feature holds a monopoly or even a majority in what is preferable. Moreover, preference doesn't always imply escapism. You can still hold a favoritism to content without being dependent on that content. Although I think it's fair to say that this distinction does not reciprocate. Candidates for escapism would exclusively be those preferable to the consumer. Still, stories are objectively reducible to its components, and so too must the properties of escapism, which is encapsulated within story. But how is this compatible with what I just proved before, which is that escapism doesn't belong to writing in the first place? How can the same property that brings people to favor a genre of media be existent at the same time in something altogether completely unrelated, like sports, for instance, and still be called the same thing? Well, by this criteria, it quite simply necessitates that the property of escapism, which differs very much from person to person, is instead best described strictly by what it isn't and how far it takes you away from that which it is not. And this really seems to be the universal factor that influences how much something can be used as an escape. It rather intuitively depends on what you are escaping from, which explains why the preferences on content that satisfy this criteria has such great range and appears to be random. This also explains how an activity can still be used for escapism when it shares no properties with other medium of entertainment that are evidently more widely effective at doing so. It is because purely what the activity isn't is what serves to constitute this standard, as well as how, despite being counterintuitive, a given task that seems more difficult or complex and therefore provides more problems than something you are escaping from is still possible to escape to. For example, while perhaps Elder Scrolls may be effective at simulating a radical environment that is capable of modifications used to add a plethora of new problems that clearly make the game harder to play, it still accomplishes the task of bringing the consumer away from their problems in the same way that sports, school, drugs, or just throwing a rock at a wall might, all of which simply replace the type of problem someone is dealing with, either because they are more appealing to solve or have more appealing rewards. So in a sense, immersion, which can be described as the results of efforts to pull you into and therefore away from in the opposite direction of problems unique to a setting, turns out to be in direct correlation with escapism. In fact, immersion is at times a very real counter to relatability as described in my earlier videos, thus making things like empathy more difficult to manifest, and is further proof that the deck is stacked against designers in this regard, and is yet another reason why pre-production is so fucking important. But regardless, it turns out that the component of storytelling that brings people to escape to it is ultimately the conflict, which immersion provides the grounds for. Even if the point of the game or media has no conflict at all, it's the fact that it isn't posing the problems they already have is what is appealing. So in short, escapist fiction does not exist. There is only escapism in whatever a person uses to reach it. Fiction, however, because it offers the greatest capability of producing the most radical environments, excels at creating and meeting the widest array of content that satisfies the criteria for escapism with its unique conflicts. To put that in other ways, you may very well remember, setting dictates everything, including characters, plot, and conflict, all of which will be nurtured if I get what I demand of the industry, which is more pre-production and consequently more originality to follow. And so you might say, and are fully entitled to do so, that I am sowing the destruction of my own craft. Given what we have established so far, which is that gaming is quite capable of inducing addictions if you grant the premise that super stimuli serve as candidates for behavioral addictions, and that gaming as a stimuli is quite more powerful than any form of media due to the fact that it offers more in terms of the experience and is just as widely accessible and is continuously rising in prevalence and potency, then yes, there appears to be a perceivable impending threat. So what is the solution? It seems hopeless, doesn't it? We can all say, without a doubt, that gaming isn't going anywhere, so a Hail Mary long shot idea of banning it can be dismissed, and rightly so. On the other hand, infringing on artistic elements that can be labeled as addicting or slandered with baseless bad stigma like sexism will never work, especially if it means cutting into profits, meaning regulations are also off the table, so realistically there is no feasible solution, right? If you are of this opinion, then I am glad to assure you that you are incorrect. I can also guarantee you the answer will please you. Full speed ahead is how we will reconcile these issues. You see, I don't believe it's a coincidence that the strongest engine for the potency of gaming is also the biggest benefit: first-hand experience. Unlike its predecessors, I believe, while we have reached a threshold where entertainment value inspires escapism, so has the threshold for the potential to empathize with the depicted experience. I believe the ability to impose an experience on the consumer has the greatest chance now with gaming than it ever has with any medium that predates it. So why is this good, and how does it combat the inevitable problems escapism entails? Well, simply put, the ability to walk away from an experience with genuine feelings can impact us in a genuine way. This is based on the fact that when a group of people experience something together, they can all relate to each other because they all share the experience. They all have a say into what it felt like and whether it was painful, pleasurable, or both, and anywhere in between. So when gaming can emulate experiences shared by everyone who plays them by virtue of the fact that the experience is 100% the same to everyone because it is literally the exact same game every time you play it, a communication can evolve that theoretically bypasses culture, language, sex, and creed. And I would assert that acquisition of ethical values is also possible in this communication. Real-life ethical principles. Now, it's true that a given person's playthrough of a game will differ depending on things like RNG, lag, glitches, but these things are easier to address with game design itself and should strictly be viewed for the technicalities they are. And as I've said before, people who don't pay attention or don't care for the detail, it's your fault if you don't pay attention. There's no reason anyone can give you to feel one way or another if you aren't compelled by reasoning. The real questionable component of the idea that experience acquired by gaming having genuine use is life, which provides the ground for doubt, is whether or not gaming can, in fact, produce genuine experiences, or at least experience that can hold a candle to the real thing. And make no mistake, I'm talking about the heavy hitters here. I'm talking about experiences that can change the way you live your life, like death, guilt, courage, hatred, forgiveness, ambition, love, and sorrow. Can games as a medium ever get to the point where playing them can make you a stronger person in real life? Can they actually make you strong when other adults piss themselves? Can they actually instill conviction in the ambivalent, dignity in the wretched, or perhaps even, dare I say it, modesty in the egocentric? Well, as I think I've already proven, media, and if not gaming, will eventually evolve to the point where super stimuli can compel us because of our innate disposition to it. It is really not a matter of being able to tell the difference between what is real and what isn't. It's the fact that it will be overwhelmingly obvious which is not real, because one is so much better than the other. It is not really a matter of whether or not the authenticity of depicted stimuli will match the real thing, as the whole problem with super stimuli is that it never seems to have mattered to our instincts, but regardless, it will eventually never fail to do so. So the real question, it seems, of whether or not experience from games can substitute any real thing with real weight in its legitimacy is reducible to this. Is empathy real? Can I ever say that I understand what you're going through, if I never have? Is it really good enough that I only have a similar experience? Do principles learned in fake experience apply to the real world, even if I can tell the difference between what is real and what isn't? If empathy is real, then I would have to say yes. It is possible to understand one another, and in some respects I have to believe that. As a human being, I have to believe that we are not completely isolated from each other except by our own will. Now, unfortunately, most people will reject this idea completely, almost instinctively, I would say. And I won't even try to tell them they're wrong. If you've been through hell, I'll shut right the fuck up. I wouldn't even dare try to tell you I've felt what you have felt, and it's just as real. I don't have the courage to start from that place. I'm not enough of a man to look you in the face and be leveled by the pain in your eyes. I wouldn't stand a chance, not even for a second. But here's the thing, and why I have to believe it as an artist no matter how much it hurts. If you think that it isn't possible to portray and understand pain and emotion with authenticity, then what you're saying is that all efforts to do so in the past are fake, of which all art and forms of expression are included and are therefore meaningless, are wrong, that they fail. You're saying that every attempt to ever show anyone how they feel has failed to do so, that every picture ever painted to represent the metaphysical is nonsense. Every song ever sang, including the ones you listen to when you're hurting, is all empty noise. Every actor who has ever tried to dive deep into who they are portraying is fooling themselves. Every poem, and indeed all of literature, is little more than the self-ingratiating inflation of an inept human's ego trying to sell you something. You're saying that there was never any hope to begin with, that every tear we ever cried because of something beautiful or tragic is all of us flattering ourselves as we pat ourselves on the back for thinking we feel sorry for someone or happy for him or her. I do not believe that. I do not believe these are all pointless gestures, pointless forms of expression. I believe it is possible to reach and capture experience that can change our lives with this medium. And the only real question is whether or not gaming can reach that territory. Can the art form achieve a display of mastery reserved only for the most iconic classical performances? This is the question I'm trying to answer in my lifetime. I created Generation specifically to answer this question, specifically to accomplish this task. I aim to punctuate the era in which the composition of the medium begins to meet this standard and command the respect worthy of that endeavor.